Thank you for leading us, by the way, this morning. Methodists are a singing people. Always been that way. We're a people who experience God, and we write a song about it. And we're not bashful to sing, unless you're like me. And then if I'm going to lead you in song, that's the greatest threat I'll ever make against you. So we'll let Kevin stick with that, and I'll do what little part I can do. So this week we're going to continue in a series that we've been going on for several weeks now, entitled "Follow Me." And if you were here last week, in some ways this week is going to extend an idea that ran throughout last week in this idea of submission. If you weren't, you can go back online and watch it. And today is one I'm just going to tell you straight up from the get-go. Today is not the day that you're going to leave going, let's go charge the world for Jesus. Today's the day where you're going to go, oh no. Today's probably one of those days you're going to have like the prophets have, as I was sharing with Roy and Kathy this morning in the prayer chapel. And by the way, any of you are welcome to join us on any given Sunday in the prayer chapel before this service. You might have one of those days like the prophets had when they ran into God. Woe is me, for I am undone. Get away from me. I am not really there yet. Fair warning. Okay? Because today is one of those times where we grapple with the tension that exists in following Jesus. And let me give it to you in the front. If you got your bulletin, there's a little note section on there. And it says the verse I like best. I don't care if you don't like a verse. I want you to write this down, because this is, in a nutshell, the tension you're going to deal with, that I deal with, that we all deal with when we accept the invitation to follow Jesus. And here it is. You ready? I want to want what Jesus wants more than what I want, but I just don't. I want to want what Jesus wants more than what I want, but I just don't. Now, that may be a tension that you've never endeavored to articulate, and you might want to argue with me about that. But if today, when we look at our old pal here, and Laura alluded to him this morning, we look at our friend Judas, sometimes it's easy to look at the story of Judas and go, scoundrel. I can't believe he would do that to the Lord. But you know, one thing that I've discovered the more I follow Jesus is that there's a little bit more of Judas in me than I care to tell you about. There's a little bit more of Judas in my DNA than makes me comfortable saying at parties. You know, we were talking about it. Well, yeah, because it's just the reality of who we are. And so today we're going to deal in this tension, like I said, about we secretly, whether we say it out loud or not, or whether we just kind of intuit it, it's something in our gut. In this whole Jesus following thing, we want to want what Jesus wants more than what we want. But we just don't oftentimes. And that's a hard thing to come to grips with. But hopefully by the end of our time this morning, we can deal with that just a little bit. So if you brought your Bible with you, or if your Bible's on your phone, by all means use that. If you don't mind, turn the ringer off. I'd be grateful to you. And we'll be in Matthew chapter 26. Get a little context this morning. So as you know, throughout the course of this series, Jesus has several times articulated to his disciples how his life's going to end, what's going to happen to him. They've not been very happy about that. Last week we saw that Peter actually took Jesus by the arm and read him the riot act. And this week you're going to actually see what it looks like to get a glimpse into the leadership circle of Jesus as we read in this. So if you brought your Bible, you can follow on the screen if you haven't. Now, while Jesus was at Bethany being just a little bit outside of Jerusalem, about 2 miles, in the house of Simon the leper. And I only want to call your attention to that one, because if Jesus is in the house and the disciples are in the house of a leper, that must mean that the leper's been healed. And so this is just a good way for you to tie up other stories in the gospel that Jesus is visiting somebody he probably healed. So how you like that? Jesus just shows up at your house one day. Hey, we're coming in for your house today. What? Okay, come on in. So he's at Simon the leper's house, and a woman comes to him with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment, and she pours it on Jesus' head as he sat or reclined at the table, which is a low table on the floor. So he's laying in the floor, kind of propped up on his elbow, and she comes in behind him, and breaks the neck off this alabaster jar. It looks like that bottle. For those of you who are a little bit more seasoned than me, you remember I Dream of Jeannie? You remember the bottle she was in? Had that little big shaped neck? Well, this is the alabaster jar that she's got. It's got a neck on it like that, and the neck is so small that it's made to trap this expensive perfume. And so she has to break the neck on that jar to put this on Jesus' head, which is interesting that they leave it out of the story. And when the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why is this waste? For the ointment could have been sold for a large sum of money and given to the poor," in verse 9. If you read in Mark's gospel, Mark has it, Matthew writes here that it's all the disciples who are mad. Mark writes it that there's a few of them that are mad. So whether it's all, whether it's a few, John gives us a better look. He says in John chapter 12, he says, "But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples," you got to love John's commentary, right? He's like the Howard Cosell of the Gospels. He does this. He says, "Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples," in quotations, the one who's going to betray him, John commentary, says, "Why was this oil not sold for 300 silver coins and given to the poor?" And then John adds his commentary again. "Now Judas said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money box, he was used to stealing what was put in it." Now, I want you to get your head around the fact that Jesus is traveling around with someone in his midst that everybody in his sphere of influence seems to notice is a thief, and Jesus hadn't done anything about it yet. Any of you run an organization and know somebody's stealing from you? Heck, you don't even have to run an organization. Anybody have access to your money? And can you fathom a time where they could steal your money and you wouldn't go, "What are you doing?" "I'm calling the sheriff." But Jesus continues to go along with this guy who's stealing from him. What do you do with that? What's more is that the whole gospel writing this morning is around this notion that Judas gives the impression that he is really, with some of his friends, they really care about the poor. For look at what he does. He looks at Jesus by way of implication and says Jesus doesn't care for the poor. Now, you want to talk about guts. Last week we grabbed Jesus by the arm. This week we give the impression that Jesus doesn't care about the poor. You say, "How'd you get that?" Why this waste? She pours it on Jesus. She wastes this expensive perfume on Jesus. That's the implication. Now, somebody in your leadership circle basically, like, this is what it really means to be a leader, right? You got all these people around you who are great personalities, but they got other agendas. And so this is where we get today, is we start to see some of the other agenda bubble up. As John says, not that he cared about the poor, that he cared about himself. Yuck. But then Jesus, back to the Matthew version that we got on the screen here, but Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you troubling this woman? She has performed a good service for me. For you'll always have the poor with you, but I will not always be with you." Okay. Well, by pouring this oil on my body, she has anointed me for burial. Ladies, I want to stop right here and just say, as you heard me say before, the ladies were the first evangelists in the gospel. They showed up at the tomb while the men were hiding, shaking, and scared. It was you ladies who showed up at the tomb and went back to tell other people that Jesus was alive, he is risen. Well, you were also the first person to anoint the body of Jesus. This lady. Jesus interprets it. Remember, they go to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body when he's behind the tomb, but they can't do it because he's not dead. He's alive. This lady has beat them to it. Ladies, you occupy a magnificent place in the story of God. If nobody else tells you that today, I'm thankful that you do. Because if it weren't for you, I'm not really sure we men would ever get it. But that's a side note. And so, she has prepared me for burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. Do you think, and here's the other point I want to come to this morning, do you think that she came to do this for Jesus because she wanted to make a name for herself? I don't either. In fact, I think she came because she sang songs like we sang this morning. She recognized that the God of all creation stood in front of her and his love never failed. That everything that she secretly wanted to be, he is making her. That he is holy, that he is beautiful, and that he continues to transform people. And in fact, now I don't know that I think she's hit one of those spells where she is just completely taken over by emotion, by love, and she does the only thing she knows to do for him is share with the world that he is beautiful. This beautiful smell fills the whole house. Oh, it's fantastic. It is fantastic that she does this. And look at Jesus' words. Wherever this gospel's preached, you're in the midst of hearing that the word of God is true this morning. Wherever this gospel's preached, they will talk about her. This will be remembered about her. This will be remembered about her. Now, let's be honest. You say, I thought you were talking about wanting what Jesus wants. I'm trying to get there. But as normal, I got more stuff than I got time, so I got to hustle. Here's the deal, right? Is that Judas, though, chastised Jesus and everybody else and this lady. And I'm alleged to you this morning that it's going to prove out here in a minute that he wasn't interested in serving the poor. Maybe he was interested in being known. Maybe he was interested in making a name for himself. And then you have juxtaposed with that desire, you have this lady who doesn't care if anybody knows her. In fact, we don't even know her. That she's done something beautiful for Jesus. And it's completely unknown except for the fact that we retell the story. And maybe somehow along the way, we have to come to grips with this in following Jesus, that it's never going to be one of those things where we get to be well known. It's going to be one of those things where we just get to love and serve others. And when the whole trip's over, nobody even knows that we were on the ride. But that's counter to what we experience in the world, isn't it? Because listen to me. This is the case. Is that we live in a world where you're supposed to be known. You're supposed to be famous. When you live in this world, you can create content all on your own, all day long. You can take selfies. You can make videos of this, that, and the other. You can post it on YouTube. You can be a rock star, your own rock star in your own world. And it's encouraged for us. And then you hear somebody like me, or you're in your local church and you hear, but it's about serving others. It's about making sure that Jesus is known when you follow him. It's not about your name being exalted, not about my name being exalted. And then we come to grips with, we have these clashing agendas, these two messages that come together. One, be famous in your world. Two, be anonymous in Jesus' world. And we have to deal with the fact that we live in this colliding agenda, these tensions in our lives, where we hear that we're supposed to want all this great stuff that Jesus wants for us, but then everything else we swim in during the week, during the hours of our day, tells us, no, you're supposed to want to be famous. You're supposed to want to be known. And then this tension shows up, where on the one hand, we want to want what Jesus wants, but we're just not really sure that we do. What do you do with that? Well, maybe you're like Judas. I think, as I confessed to you this morning, I'm a little bit more like Judas than I care to admit to you. And maybe you get to the point where, in that effect, you have to come to grips with, but maybe I could just make Jesus fit my will. Maybe I can just, I'm not doing too bad. I said this, again, it's a little bit of an extension last week. I'm not too bad. I'm doing pretty good in the world. God's blessed me. Maybe if I get just close enough to him, I could convince him that my will might be a little bit better than what he had in mind. You end up in this titanic struggle with him. And that's where Judas gets to. So for a long time now, Judas has been wrestling with this notion of his agenda, like I said last week about Peter, being that the Messiah was this guy who was going to free Israel, was going to unite them, throw the Roman oppressors off, and that all of a sudden that Israel was going to step back onto the national stage, to the world stage, and be God's representative. And he figures this Jesus guy, maybe he just doesn't quite understand what all that means, and so he's going to help him a little bit. He's going to help him get into the position that he needs to be into, because clearly he's not doing a very good job. He, being Jesus, is not doing a very good job of getting himself in the position that he needs to be in if he's going to be the leader of God's people and set up God's kingdom on the earth. Now, you might not want to say this, and it's completely okay. You ever find yourself in times in your walk of following Jesus of either deliberately or inadvertently trying to strong-arm Jesus? You ever find, like, in an arm wrestling match with him, I can just get a little bit, don't make me tell. You don't want me to tell. You're like, is he stupid? Maybe. But isn't it the case that most of the time we run into these, in following Jesus, we want what he wants, but we run into these times where we're just not sure that we can do it, that we really want it? And like Judas, do you ever invent the opportunity to change Jesus' plan? You ever prayed that prayer? Probably not going to admit to this, are you? But it's okay. Dear Lord, your will should be my will, and our will should be done. No, nobody ever prays that. Only me. But look at what happens to Judas, man. He goes on in verse 14. Then one of the 12. Isn't it the case that it's oftentimes, this is just one of the great ironies Matthew writes about, isn't it the case most of the time it's the people who are the closest to you that do the most damage? Whether they mean to or not. Somebody who loves you will cut you faster than anybody. Why? Because of this thing we're talking about. We want one thing and they want another thing. And they're trying to, it's this competing agendas that we have to deal with. Is that one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, what will you give me to betray him? Him being Jesus. And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. Can you get your mind around this? Like, this is a guy who was in the inner circle with Jesus. He had seen him do the greatest miracle, maybe not for all husbands, but for some husbands. He had seen him do the greatest miracle in the history of Jesus. He healed a man's mother-in-law. Now, if you're going to heal, I know Stanley's the only one, we're the only ones laughing in this, so I got to do something to break the tension. Y'all are killing me here. I mean, I told you, this is serious stuff. But if you're traveling with Jesus and you see him heal a man's mother-in-law and you got one that you don't like all that well, he's got to be the God of all creation. Otherwise, he would not have done that. But what's going on? I mean, you see that. You see him go. You see the centurion go to him, and you're walking down the road behind him, and he says, come and heal my servant. And he says, well, but just say the word. You don't even have to come to my house. Just say the word. And at your word, Lord, it'll be done. And the guy's healed. Or that time where you'd been doing all this nonsense and you decided to put out into the ocean, you're rowing your little boat. Michael, row your boat ashore. Come on, do it. And the storm's about to sink the boat. And you look around and the brother is walking on water. I mean, you see that? I'm like, Peter, it's a ghost. What's going on? So Judas is in the circles, my point. He's seen all this great stuff. And now all of a sudden, look at what he's done. He goes to the very people who are trying to put Jesus' head in the guillotine and gets on their team. What do you do with that? You do with it when you have to acknowledge that sometimes deep inside of me that I get convinced I have very sinister motives. I get convinced that my will is better than the God of all creation's will. Ugh. And in this following Jesus thing, here's one that makes it worse. Because we don't like to be overt about thwarting Jesus' plan. We like to do the DSM diagnosable dysfunction of being passive-aggressive. We like to quit following Jesus but stay on his team. You ever work with a quit and stay? I would have been convinced that would have got yes from you. I told you it's a tense day, man. You ever work with a quit and stay? Somebody who doesn't do anything overt to thwart the plan of the business or work underneath you. They don't really do anything outwardly to overthrow what you're trying, the directives you give, but they really don't help you at all. If nobody's going to work, you can always count on this person not working. You can always count on them on the outside looking like they're all cheery and everything's good and all, yeah, man, go get them, boss. You're great. We love you. And around the water cooler, all you hear is how they run the whole plan down. How they're just digging a hole under you, as the saying goes. And they're just waiting on the trap to spring at some point. And then when you fall flat on your face, guess who the greatest cheerleader is? You know the ones I'm talking about, don't you? Sad to say, I've been in situations where I've been that person. And it's this tension that we have. Is that sometimes in our following Jesus, is that Jesus invites us to do stuff. He takes off on this plan that doesn't look like we think it ought to look like. And if he hadn't yet, he's going to for you. He's going to take off and his plan's going to look very much different than what you had envisioned it being for your life or for the life of the world. And sooner or later, and maybe it was this morning even, you got to have this battle. But don't you just want to do it my way? And when he doesn't answer you, what do? You do this? Because I'm convinced that what Judas really thinks here isn't about so much the outcomes, but I'm convinced that what he thinks is that if I can just get him into the right place, he'll have to do the things that I know he wants to secretly do. And so this is what he does. He looks for a place to betray him. And those of you who have been around the church for a while know quite well what happens. He gets arrested, right? And we move on into chapter 27 in Matthew, and it says here in verse 27, and in the morning when it came, the chief priest and the elders of the people conferred together after Jesus had been arrested against him in order to have him put to death. And they tied him up and led him away and handed him over to Pilate the governor. That seems like a benign sentence, but can you imagine Judas? All I've got to do is get him arrested. Sooner or later, this guy who is all-powerful is going to show up and crack some heads. He's going to start being the guy. He's going to be the gladiator that we want him to be. He's going to be the king that's going to break the sword out and do to the Romans like David did to the Philistine. The part you don't tell your kids, where he hacked their head off, Jesus is about to do that. And Judas is convinced that if he can just get him into that position, because he won't do it on his own. But then you have this. You imagine what goes on in Jesus' mind, or Judas's mind, when they see him lead Jesus away with his hands tied, and Jesus just goes with him. You imagine what's going on in his mind? This ain't the plan. What's happening here? And he starts to hyperventilate. And he starts to wonder, when's he going to do it? Am I even going to be able to see it? Because I set all this stuff into motion. I don't want to not have a ringside seat, right? I mean, I quit, but I stayed on for this very reason. I wanted to so I could go, yeah! But then you recognize, and here's the immutable fact this morning, then you recognize And this is the other thing you might want to write down, because it's a thing we all deal with. It's that God's hand, it will not be forced. But his will also will not be thwarted. God's hand will not be forced. And his will not be thwarted. But Judas has to grapple with this. And he also has to grapple with something else, right? He also has to grapple with the fact that he sees the whole thing go down. And at some point along the way, he came to the realization, he's not going to do it. He's not going to behave like I want him to. He's not going to be who I think he should be. And isn't it an interesting thing that Jesus doesn't stop Judas from doing what was in Judas's heart to do? But Judas also doesn't stop Jesus from doing what was in Jesus' heart to do either, does he? Why is that? Because God's will not be thwarted, and his hand will not be forced. But we all come to grips with this particular fact this morning. I hope this is never your story in following Jesus. I hope it's never the case for you. When Judas, his betrayer, you ever feel like the grace of God just don't get to you? Like, isn't that how you... Like, at what point does he just become Judas and he's no longer the betrayer? At what point do you not get to wear the scarlet letter, Hester? What? Isn't that amazing? And it's part and parcel of the point we're trying to get at here. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. And he said to them, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. But they said to him, so what? That's your problem. The people he thought he was on his team. When you get blood on your hands, you find out maybe you were just part of the game. But it gets worse than this. Look at what happens. Judas throws down the silver in the temple, and he leaves, and he went back and he hanged himself. And here's the point I don't want you to miss. And here's the point I don't want you to let me miss in the rest of my walk, so long as we're together as community and friends. Some decisions have irreversible consequences. Absolutely irreversible consequences. But when those trains leave the station, there just isn't any getting them back. And so in this following Jesus thing, sometimes when we come to a clash of wills, when I want to superimpose my will on Jesus rather than have his will put on top of mine, rather than to get to where we were last week, when I don't want to submit to him, and I don't want to give up my right to always be right or have my own way, the consequences are sometimes we make decisions that there's no undoing. And Judas, overcome with the overwhelming guilt of that very decision, recognizing that there are times where we want to force God's hand and we want to thwart God's will, that there are irreversible consequences, chose an irreversible solution. For him, at least. And that's why this whole, in following Jesus, like we talked about last week, this whole notion of submission, that's why it's important. Because it's only when we submit to the will of God, the one who created us, and stop wrestling and trying to bend him to our will? Can we be free of the tyranny of always having to be right? Like I said, I told you it was heavy. And it's weighed heavy on me. I woke up this morning anxious about this. Because here's the truth. This is probably going to happen to me again before I get home today. It's probably going to come down to the fact Jesus is going to direct me towards something, and I'm going to grab him by the arm just like Peter did and start into the arm wrestling match and say, no, you don't have all the facts to the one who created the facts. And so I wish I could give you some application point that would erase this, but that would be to make you less than who God created you to be, because that would be to banish the image of God from you, to alleviate you from the responsibility of free choice or your ability to even choose it. But here's what I can offer you this morning. I know it's going to happen to you this week just like it happens to me, and if it don't happen this week, it's going to happen again. Where your will, where you want to want what Jesus wants more than what you want, but you just don't. And you know it's the right thing to do, to go the direction he's pointing you, but you'd much rather go your own way. Or you'd much rather try to just force Jesus into seeing it your way. I do it all the time, friends. I'm not above it either. Here's what you have to stop and do, and it's the only solace I have found. Every time you find yourself in that trap, every time you find a hold of Jesus' arm, every time you recognize that you're trying to bend his will, you're trying to force his hand, you're trying to coerce him into doing something, stop. Take a deep breath and just acknowledge to him, I want to want what you want more than what I want. Help me. Just pray that simple prayer. I want to want what you want more than what I want. Help me. For beloved, as we sang this morning, the one who has never failed us will not fail that prayer either. Stop. Take a deep breath. And just say, pray it. I want to want what you want more than what I want. Help me. For as I said last week, Jesus knows where he's taking us. He's seen the place, and he knows where he's going. And he is not trying to lead any of us to a place that does us harm. He is trying to lead us to a place that makes us completely lovely. And our job is to make sure we can always follow him to that place. And friends, like I said this morning, I'm done. I promise. Kevin's going to lead us in a little bit of singing this morning. I recognize, this might be the worst time you've ever sit in the sanctuary. I wish I could tell you I'm sorry for that. But it's not a personal thing. Because this is real stuff about following Jesus. This is the real stuff. This is the stuff that none of the disciples took the time to write about, but it's illustrated, and it's for us to dig out. Because if we don't talk about stuff like this, and we don't acknowledge it in our own walk, here's what I know will be true, is that when you fail, you'll always hear the betrayer in your mind. Because somebody will always whisper it to you. Somebody who isn't interested in you becoming everything God created you to be. And you'll quit. And you'll quit. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging that we want Jesus' will more than ours, but we just don't. Because he's been in the business of saving lives a whole lot longer than we have. And in reality, when we acknowledge it, we give him space to say, and here's your next step. And so this morning, I don't know what your next step is. Maybe it's at the altar. Maybe it's with somebody you're sitting by. Maybe it's somebody on the other end of the phone when we get done, if we get done. I don't know what it is. But what I know is that please hear my encouragement, that whatever the Spirit of God is kind of prodding you toward this morning, be sensitive to that. Because I know deep in my heart, just like what you know deep in your heart, that you want what Jesus wants more than what you want. This is a space for you to look at him and say, help me do that as we sing this morning.